You can walk every single day, hit 10,000 steps, eat smaller meals than you used to, and still watch belly fat refuse to disappear after the age of 50. For millions of older adults, this has become one of the most frustrating and emotionally exhausting health battles of modern aging. People blame themselves. They think they have become lazy, weak, or somehow broken. But according to growing medical research, that is not the real story at all. The truth is far more complex, and far more revealing. What changes after 50 is not simply your appearance. Your entire metabolic system begins operating under a different set of biological rules. The body that once burned calories quickly and responded rapidly to exercise slowly becomes more protective, more conservative, and more resistant to releasing stored fat, especially around the abdomen. And now, researchers and health experts are paying closer attention to one surprisingly powerful factor that most people overlook entirely. Timing. There is a narrow metabolic window in the early morning, shortly after waking up, when the body becomes significantly more willing to tap into stored fat reserves for energy. If that window is used correctly, even a simple morning walk can begin shifting the body toward fat utilization. But if the window is interrupted by certain common habits, the opportunity is largely lost before the walk even begins. In this documentary, we are going inside the science of what truly happens inside the body after 50. Why belly fat becomes stubborn. Why morning metabolism behaves differently. Why walking before breakfast may matter more than people realize. And why one seemingly harmless habit performed by millions every morning may be silently sabotaging fat loss efforts without them ever knowing. To understand why this matters, we first need to understand what aging actually does to the body after the age of 50. Muscle mass naturally declines in a process known medically as sarcopenia. According to data published through the National Institutes of Health, adults can lose between 3 and 8% of muscle mass every decade after the age of 30. And the rate accelerates later in life. That decline carries enormous consequences because muscle is not just for strength or mobility. Muscle tissue acts like a metabolic engine. It constantly burns energy, even while resting. As that engine weakens, the body's baseline calorie expenditure drops. The result is subtle at first: a few extra pounds, slightly tighter clothing, reduced stamina. But over time, fat accumulation begins accelerating, particularly around the waistline. At the same time, another hidden shift begins occurring inside the bloodstream. Insulin sensitivity starts declining. Research from the American Diabetes Association has repeatedly shown that aging adults, especially those with lower activity levels, become increasingly resistant to insulin over time. When that happens, glucose remains in the bloodstream longer. The body struggles to process energy efficiently. More calories are redirected into fat storage, and much of that storage happens directly around the abdominal area. This is why so many people after 50 experience a confusing and discouraging reality. Their arms may stay relatively similar. Their legs may not change dramatically. But the stomach area becomes increasingly resistant to change. And then comes the role of stress. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, has become one of the most discussed subjects in metabolic health research. Studies connected to institutions such as Harvard Medical School have linked chronically elevated cortisol levels with increased abdominal fat storage. Poor sleep, emotional pressure, financial stress, social isolation, overtraining, and even chronic inflammation can all contribute to elevated cortisol signaling. From an evolutionary standpoint, the body interprets stress as danger, and when the body senses danger, it becomes less willing to release stored energy. Instead, it stores more fat around vital organs as a protective survival mechanism. This means belly fat after 50 is not simply about eating too much. It is the visible result of deeper biological changes happening beneath the surface. Reduced muscle mass, declining insulin sensitivity, elevated stress signaling, slower metabolic flexibility, all operating simultaneously. And unless those internal conditions are addressed correctly, Even disciplined people can struggle for years without seeing meaningful results, but this is where the story becomes extremely important because while aging changes metabolism, it does not eliminate the body's ability to burn fat. What changes is the condition under which fat burning becomes easier or harder. And according to growing evidence from metabolic research, one of the most powerful conditions occurs during the early hours of the morning, before food enters the system. When you wake up in the morning, your body exists in a completely different metabolic condition compared to the rest of the day. During sleep, the body continues performing thousands of essential functions without interruption. The brain remains active, the heart continues pumping blood, hormones regulate internal repair processes, cells continue consuming energy hour after hour, even while the body appears motionless. But during that entire period, one critical factor changes dramatically. No new food enters the system for most people. This creates a fasting period lasting somewhere between 8 and 12 hours. And during those hours, the body gradually consumes much of its immediately available stored glucose, also known as glycogen. Insulin levels decline. Blood sugar stabilizes at a lower baseline. The digestive system becomes inactive. This creates what scientists refer to as the fasted state, and this state changes the body's fuel priorities in ways that many people never fully understand under normal daytime conditions. Especially after eating carbohydrates, the body prefers to use incoming food as its primary energy source. Glucose becomes abundant. Insulin rises. Energy from recent meals becomes easily accessible. Fat storage mechanisms remain active while fat release becomes more restricted. But during the fasted state, the situation shifts because food is no longer immediately available. The body begins searching for alternative energy sources. One of the most important of those sources is stored fat. Research published in journals such as the American Journal of Physiology has demonstrated that fat oxidation increases significantly when insulin levels remain low. In simple terms, the body becomes more willing to burn fat for fuel when it is not actively processing recently consumed food. This is why timing suddenly becomes so important if a person wakes up and immediately eats breakfast before activity. Insulin begins rising almost immediately. Even a small meal can trigger this response. Once insulin rises, the body starts prioritizing incoming calories for fuel. The reliance on stored fat decreases, but if walking begins before food intake, the body enters activity without recent fuel availability. It still needs energy to sustain movement. The heart rate rises slightly. Muscles require fuel. Circulation increases. And because insulin remains low, the body shifts more heavily towards stored energy reserves. This does not mean the body burns only fat. Human metabolism is far more complex than that. But it does mean the balance of fuel usage moves more strongly toward fat utilization, and for adults over 50, that shift can become incredibly valuable, especially because walking itself represents one of the safest and most sustainable forms of exercise available to aging populations. Unlike high-impact workouts that stress the joints and elevate injury risk, walking remains accessible to millions of people regardless of fitness background. It improves circulation, cardiovascular health, mobility, insulin response, and mental well-being, all while placing relatively low stress on the body. That combination is exactly why researchers have become increasingly interested in fasted walking specifically. Over the last decade, studies connected to sports science departments and metabolic health institutions have examined how fasted exercise influences fat oxidation. Multiple findings have pointed in the same direction. Exercise performed in a fasted state tends to increase fat usage during activity compared to exercise performed after eating. More importantly, some experts believe it may also improve metabolic flexibility over time. Metabolic flexibility refers to the body's ability to switch efficiently between different fuel sources depending on circumstances. A metabolically flexible body can transition smoothly between burning carbohydrates and burning fat. But aging, inactivity, chronic overeating, poor sleep, and insulin resistance can weaken this ability. When that flexibility declines, The body becomes increasingly dependent on constant food intake and increasingly resistant to accessing stored fat. This is one reason many people feel constantly hungry, low in energy, or unable to lose abdominal weight despite exercising regularly. Fasted walking may help retrain some of those energy pathways gradually over time. However, experts also warn against misunderstanding what this actually means. This is not magic. Walking before breakfast does not override poor sleep, chronic stress, excessive calorie intake, or years of metabolic dysfunction overnight. It is not a shortcut. It is not an instant solution. And it does not guarantee dramatic transformation within days. What it does provide is a strategic metabolic advantage: a low insulin environment, increased reliance on stored energy, reduced digestive competition during activity, improved consistency due to simplicity, and for many adults over 50, that combination may align far more naturally with how the body now functions during aging. But there is another layer to this story that makes the situation even more surprising, because millions of people unintentionally destroy this fasted fat-burning environment every single morning without realizing it. Not through overeating, not through lack of exercise, but through one small habit they believe is completely harmless. And according to metabolic experts, that mistake may quietly cancel much of the effect before the walk even starts. For many older adults, the morning routine feels harmless, even healthy. Wake up, drink a cup of coffee, add a little sugar, maybe flavored creamer, perhaps a glass of juice, a small cracker, half a banana, something light, for energy. Before heading out for a walk, it seems reasonable. In fact, millions of people believe they are helping their bodies by avoiding exercise on an empty stomach. But metabolically, that small habit changes the entire equation within minutes, because the moment calories enter the bloodstream, especially carbohydrates or sugar, the body responds immediately with insulin release. And insulin changes everything. Insulin is one of the most powerful storage hormones in the human body. Its primary role is to help move glucose out of the bloodstream and into cells for energy or storage. But while insulin is elevated, fat release becomes significantly reduced. The body essentially receives a signal that fresh fuel has arrived and stored energy is no longer the priority. This is the critical detail many people never hear. Even small amounts of sugar can interrupt the fasted metabolic environment. That sweetened coffee, that flavored creamer, that small, healthy snack. They may seem insignificant emotionally, but biologically they shift the body away from relying heavily on stored fat and back toward burning incoming calories instead. And after 50, when fat metabolism is already slower and insulin sensitivity is often reduced, that interruption matters even more. Experts in metabolic health increasingly emphasize that consistency in hormonal conditions often matters more than people realize. The body responds to signals. Low insulin encourages stored energy release. Elevated insulin suppresses it. The transition can happen rapidly. This is why many practical recommendations for fasted walking remain surprisingly simple: water before the walk, black coffee if necessary, plain tea without sugar, no calories, no creamers, no sweeteners that trigger insulin responses. For some people, this adjustment feels minor. For others, especially those emotionally attached to morning comfort routines, it feels difficult at first. But over weeks and months, the metabolic difference can become meaningful. And that brings us to another major misunderstanding surrounding fat loss after 50. Intensity. Modern fitness culture often promotes the idea that harder is always better. More sweat, more exhaustion, higher heart rates, longer workouts, faster movement. But for older adults, especially during fasted exercise, excessive intensity can sometimes become counterproductive. When exercise intensity rises too high, the body activates stronger stress responses. Cortisol production increases, adrenaline surges, the nervous system shifts toward survival mode. Under these conditions, The body often begins relying more heavily on quick-access fuel pathways rather than efficient long-duration fat utilization. Research connected to organizations such as the American College of Sports Medicine consistently supports moderate-intensity activity as one of the most sustainable approaches for long-term metabolic health and fat utilization, and walking fits that model. Almost perfectly moderate walking keeps oxygen flow stable. Circulation improves. Joint stress remains manageable. Fat oxidation stays active without excessively spiking stress hormones. Most importantly, it is repeatable because ultimately, consistency matters far more than intensity. A brutal workout performed once every 2 weeks cannot compete with a sustainable daily habit repeated for months. One of the simplest ways experts measure appropriate walking intensity is through what is known as the talk test. If you can still speak in short sentences while walking, but feel slightly challenged, you are likely within the optimal moderate intensity zone. Not gasping, not exhausted, not pushing to collapse, just steady, controlled movement. This is especially important after 50 because recovery capacity changes with age. Overtraining becomes easier. Joint inflammation becomes more common. Sleep quality can decline. Excessive strain can elevate cortisol levels further, creating the exact hormonal environment associated with abdominal fat retention. In other words, trying too hard can sometimes backfire. And yet, another overlooked factor quietly influences the effectiveness of morning walking before most people even leave the house: hydration. After a full night of sleep, the body naturally wakes up mildly dehydrated. Respiration during sleep causes fluid loss hour after hour. Even mild dehydration can affect circulation, energy levels, cardiovascular efficiency, and metabolic function. Drinking water before walking helps restore blood volume, improve oxygen delivery, and support energy utilization during movement. Then there is caffeine. Studies suggest caffeine may temporarily increase alertness and stimulate the release of fatty acids into the bloodstream, potentially supporting fat utilization during exercise. This is why black coffee before fasted cardio has become popular in both athletic and health-focused communities. But again, the condition remains critical: no sugar, no high-calorie additives, because the moment insulin rises significantly, the entire metabolic advantage begins weakening again. And while all of this may sound highly technical, the long-term outcome becomes surprisingly simple. Small biological decisions repeated consistently every morning can slowly reshape how the body uses energy over time. But the real transformation does not happen overnight. It happens gradually, week by week, often so subtly that people fail to notice the changes until months have passed. One of the biggest reasons people abandon healthy routines after 50 is not failure. It is impatience. Modern culture has conditioned people to expect immediate visible results. Fast transformations, rapid weight loss, dramatic before and after images within days. But the human body, especially an aging body, does not operate on social media timelines. It responds slowly, carefully, and often invisibly at first. That is why so many people quit too early during the first 1 or 2 weeks of consistent morning walking. Most individuals experience very little visible fat loss. In many cases, the scale barely changes at all. This creates frustration and self-doubt. People begin assuming the routine is not working, but internally, important changes may already be starting. Circulation improves, blood sugar regulation becomes more stable, daily movement patterns become normalized, energy levels often begin rising slightly, sleep quality may improve, inflammatory stress can gradually decrease. These are foundational metabolic shifts, not cosmetic ones, and while they are harder to see in the mirror, they often determine whether long-term fat loss eventually becomes possible. By weeks 3 and 4, many people begin noticing smaller but meaningful differences: reduced bloating, slightly looser clothing around the waist, improved walking endurance, less stiffness in the morning, better mood stability. This stage becomes psychologically critical because it represents the transition between effort and visible reinforcement. Then somewhere between weeks 6 and 8, the changes often become harder to ignore. Waist measurements slowly decrease. Posture improves, walking pace becomes easier to maintain, the body begins adapting to movement instead of resisting it, and perhaps most importantly, Consistency starts feeling normal rather than forced. This is where long-term metabolic research becomes extremely important. Studies examining sustainable fat reduction repeatedly show that gradual lifestyle adaptation consistently outperforms extreme short-term interventions. Crash diets may produce temporary weight loss, but they often damage muscle mass, elevate stress hormones, and become psychologically unsustainable. Walking, by contrast, works differently. It integrates into daily life, it lowers resistance, it reduces injury risk, and when paired with appropriate timing and nutritional awareness, it creates conditions the body can realistically maintain for years rather than weeks. This is especially important after 50 because preservation becomes just as valuable as reduction. Many older adults focus entirely on losing weight while unintentionally sacrificing muscle in the process. But excessive muscle loss further slows metabolism, weakens mobility, increases fall risk, and accelerates physical aging. Sustainable walking routines help avoid many of those dangers by encouraging movement without overwhelming the body. There is also a deeper psychological dimension often ignored in fitness discussions. Morning walking creates structure for retired adults, individuals dealing with loneliness, or people navigating emotional stress later in life. Routine itself becomes therapeutic. Waking up with purpose changes mental momentum. Exposure to sunlight helps regulate circadian rhythms. Light movement reduces anxiety signaling. Even short daily walks can create emotional stability that extends far beyond physical appearance. And in recent years, experts have begun connecting abdominal fat not only to physical disease, but also to chronic inflammation and cognitive decline. Research increasingly suggests that visceral fat, the fat stored deep around organs, may contribute to inflammatory processes associated with cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and even neurodegenerative conditions. This means reducing abdominal fat after 50 is not merely about aesthetics anymore. It is about long-term survival, mobility, and quality of life. That reality changes the emotional weight of this conversation entirely because for many people, this is no longer about looking younger, it is about remaining independent, remaining active, remaining alive long enough to enjoy children, grandchildren, travel, purpose, and dignity. And yet, despite all these benefits, many people unknowingly sabotage themselves through inconsistency. One week they walk daily, the next week they stop entirely, then they restart aggressively, then quit again after not seeing rapid results. This cycle becomes devastating because the body thrives on repetition, not emotional bursts of motivation. The individuals who often succeed long-term are not necessarily the most disciplined or athletic. They are usually the ones who simplify the process enough to continue doing it repeatedly even when progress feels slow, and that may be the most important lesson hidden inside all this research. The body after 50 still responds, it still adapts, it still burns fat. But it responds differently than it did decades earlier. It rewards patience more than intensity, timing more than punishment, consistency more than extremes, and perhaps most importantly, it rewards understanding how hormones influence energy, understanding how insulin changes fuel usage, understanding why moderate movement can outperform exhausting routines, understanding that aging is not the end of metabolic health, but rather the beginning of a different biological strategy. Because once people stop fighting their bodies and start working with them instead, the results often become far more sustainable than they ever imagined possible. But there is one final piece many experts say people still underestimate completely, and it may explain why some walkers continue struggling despite believing they are doing everything correctly. For many adults over 50, the real obstacle is not laziness, lack of discipline, or even lack of exercise. It is misunderstanding. People often assume that if they are moving more, they should automatically be losing fat. But the human body is not a simple machine responding only to movement. It responds to signals, timing, hormones, recovery, sleep quality, nutrition, stress exposure, and long-term consistency. When those factors are ignored, even good habits can produce disappointing results. This is why so many older adults walk every day and still feel trapped in the same cycle year after year. The truth is, walking itself is only one part of a much larger metabolic picture: sleep. For example, plays an enormous role in fat regulation after 50. Poor sleep increases cortisol production, disrupts appetite hormones like ghrelin and leptin, worsens insulin resistance, and increases cravings for fast energy foods the following day. Even a perfect walking routine becomes harder to sustain when the nervous system is operating under chronic sleep deprivation. Then there is emotional stress. Modern life places constant pressure on aging adults. Financial uncertainty, caregiving responsibilities, loneliness, chronic worry about health, social isolation after retirement. These pressures do not simply affect emotions. They directly influence biology. When stress remains elevated for long periods, the body shifts into a protective state. Fat storage increases, especially around the abdomen. Energy levels fluctuate unpredictably. Cravings intensify. Recovery slows. The body becomes more defensive metabolically because it interprets chronic stress as a survival threat, and this is where morning walking becomes more powerful than most people realize, because beyond calorie burning or fat utilization, walking helps regulate the nervous system itself. Steady movement lowers stress signaling. Breathing patterns stabilize. Exposure to daylight supports hormonal balance. Mental clarity improves. The body slowly exits survival mode and begins functioning in a more balanced state. This is why health experts increasingly describe walking not simply as exercise, but as metabolic therapy. And perhaps the greatest advantage of all is accessibility. Not everyone can perform high-intensity workouts after 50. Joint pain, arthritis, back problems, previous injuries, cardiovascular limitations, and reduced recovery capacity make aggressive training unrealistic for millions of people. But walking remains available to almost everyone. No expensive equipment, no gym membership, no complicated learning curve, just movement. Consistent, controlled movement aligned with how the aging body actually functions. That simplicity is exactly why walking continues surviving every new fitness trend decade after decade. While fad workouts rise and disappear, walking remains one of the most researched and sustainable health interventions ever studied, and when combined with proper timing, especially during the fasted morning state, its effectiveness becomes even more practical for older adults seeking gradual fat reduction. Still, experts continue emphasizing one critical point: this is not about perfection. Missing one morning does not destroy progress. Drinking coffee with cream one day does not erase weeks of consistency. The goal is not obsession. The goal is alignment, creating conditions where the body is more likely to use stored fat, reducing hormonal interference, building routines realistic enough to maintain long term, because after 50, sustainability matters far more than intensity. And perhaps this explains why so many extreme weight loss programs fail. They demand behaviors that cannot realistically continue for years. Eventually, the body becomes exhausted. Motivation collapses. Old habits return. Walking works differently because it integrates naturally into daily life instead of fighting against it. But there is another truth many people need to hear clearly. Fat loss after 50 will almost always happen slower than people want, and that is normal. Healthy fat reduction is gradual. Especially abdominal fat. The body often prioritizes protecting those reserves because visceral fat is deeply connected to survival signaling and hormonal regulation. Trying to force rapid change often leads to muscle loss, fatigue, and metabolic slowdown. Instead, patience becomes essential. The people who succeed are usually not the ones chasing dramatic transformations within 30 days. They are the ones who quietly continue showing up every morning, month after month, allowing biology enough time to adapt, and over time, the changes extend far beyond appearance. Walking endurance improves. Breathing becomes easier. Blood pressure often stabilizes. Confidence returns. Daily movement feels lighter. People begin trusting their bodies again instead of feeling betrayed by them. That emotional transformation may ultimately matter even more than the physical one. Because many adults after 50 carry invisible discouragement. They feel aging has taken control away from them. They feel trapped inside bodies that no longer respond the way they once did, but the science tells a different story. The body is still listening, still adapting, still capable of change. It simply requires a different strategy now than it did decades earlier, and that may be the most important takeaway of all. Walking is not just movement, it is communication with your metabolism, a daily signal telling the body to become more efficient, more resilient, and more balanced over time, especially when performed in the right conditions. Especially when performed consistently. Especially when performed with patience. If you are already walking regularly but still struggling with results, there may be additional small mistakes quietly reducing the effectiveness of your routine without you realizing it. Walking posture, pace, recovery habits, footwear, and even arm movement can all influence long-term outcomes more than most people expect. And once those hidden mistakes are corrected, the results often begin changing in ways people never thought possible. After 50,